Good afternoon. Welcome to each and all of you to Collegeville Connections, a new series of online events presented by the Collegeville Institute, which is located on the campus of St. John's University in Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of the Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs. It provides an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other and to the Collegeville Institute. Most importantly, though, you'll learn a lot from our remarkable guests. I'm Don Ottenhoff, Director of the Collegeville Institute. And before I introduce our guest for today, I'm going to turn to Susan Sink, a staff member at the Collegeville Institute. Susan is running the tech side of things for us today and will tell us what we need to know about logistics. Susan.
Okay, first I apologize that my camera isn't working, but I am here and the tech should go well. We're going to use the Q&A feature, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen, to ask questions. You can ask any question you want. If you have housekeeping questions, I will answer you through chat individually, and we'll leave up the substantive questions for that part of the presentation. The only other thing is that we are streaming it live on our Facebook page, the Collegeville Institute. So if you lose your connection and still want to watch it, you can head over there. And now I'll turn it back.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Susan. Many of us are painfully aware on this historic day that we're living at a time that demands heightened attention to our personal responsibilities in relationship to a larger historical stage than our household, for instance. 2020 was a year of consequential moral choices within civil society in the United States. And 2021 doesn't look like it will be any different. How, in fact, do people live in dark times, and how should a person live a morally responsible life in the fray of historic challenges? Victoria Barnett has spent a great deal of time exploring such questions, especially in relationship to German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German Christians, and the German churches during the period of National Socialism. Today, Victoria Barnett will talk about how Dietrich Bonhoeffer responded to his particular historical context and how his actions, his thoughts, his work might speak to us today. Collegeville Institute Scholar in 2019, Vicki served as director of the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. from 2004 until 2019. She was also one of the general editors of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works, the complete English edition of Bonhoeffer's writings published by Fortress Press. And there are a whole bunch of books that look like this. She has published extensively about the role of religious leaders and institutions during the Holocaust. Her books include two that I believe are essential reading pretty much for everyone. One is Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, published in 2000. The other is For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler, published earlier in 1992. And I should add, while there's a lot of research that goes into these books and interviews, oral history, they are very well-written books that aren't intended only for an academic readership. Vicki is an extremely good writer. So read these books for your information and for a certain level of enjoyment, even though the story is not always inspiring. It would also be hard to find a book more relevant to our moment than her recently published After 10 Years, Dietrich Bonhoeffer for Our Time. She has also translated the unabridged version of Eberhard Bethge's monumental biography on Bonhoeffer, which I'm going to hold up, but not from the front, but from the side, just to show you how thick this book is. It's over 1,000 pages long. And recently, very recently, Vicky completed a translation of a new biography of German theologian Karl Barth, titled Karl Barth, A Life in Conflict, written by Christina Tietz, which will be published by Oxford University Press. And that book is due out in May of this year. And we'll put up all this information of about books that Vicky has written on our website and other places that through which we communicate. But now on to Vicky. And I'll lead with a question for Vicky. So Vicky, you may be one of the few people on the face of the earth to have read virtually every word that Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote. So what has drawn you to this theologian and pastor who died at a relatively young age?
Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in today, because I know there are other things you could be watching. But this might be a good break for thought and reflection. I hope so. I came to Bonhoeffer the long way around. I had read Discipleship as an undergraduate. In fact, it was really a seminal book for me. I had drifted away from the church in my high school years, and the book on discipleship was one of the things that brought me back. I studied at Union Theological Seminary in my first semester. Eberhard Bethge, the biographer of Bonhoeffer, actually was teaching there. I did not sign up for his course, to my great regret, but I did hear him speak. But I went to Germany in 1979. I lived there for 13 years. And during my time in Germany, I was interested in the people who were not Bonhoeffer. And specifically the Confessing Church. I collected a number of oral histories of people who had been in that church, doing interviews and kind of looking at the big historical stage on which Bonhoeffer worked. So sort of a broad lens view of his times and his context. And then when I returned to the United States in 1992, my book came out. And that led, among other things, to the invitation to join the Bonhoeffer Works publishing project. Don held up a big book. There are 17 of them. 16 of his writings, the 17th index volume. And so I went from looking at the big historical stage to reading every line in German and every line in the English translation and all the footnotes of this individual who was going through this incredibly turbulent historical moment, and looking at him really day by day, looking at him sort of really up close. And I've thought a lot recently about what it means to sort of look at someone like that up close, but still be aware of the much larger context in which he's operating. And the one comment I would make is that I think that he himself had that level of self-awareness. And it's one of the things that makes him so interesting. He comes by it honestly. He's born in 1906, so he's a child during the First World War, loses one of his brothers who dies in France during that war. He lives through the Weimar years. He hears firsthand some of the political violence that shapes those years. And then, of course, in 1933, Adolf Hitler comes to power, and Bonhoeffer is literally only a few days short of his 26th birthday. We often forget how young he was. And of course, he is executed at the age of 39. I will add that when I was doing the oral histories for my first book, For the Soul of the People, as I said, I interviewed about 65 people who had been in the Confessing Church. I was lucky to do these interviews at a time when I could still interview people like Helmut Goldwitzer and Martin Niemöller, but I interviewed a lot of regular folks as well. And one of the things that struck me, Bonhoeffer, of course, was the name I knew. And so I would often ask people, did you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer? What was he like? And there were a number of people who said to me, you know, we never heard of him until after 1945. And I think it's important for us to think of Bonhoeffer in this moment as the person he was before he became Bonhoeffer. We tend to see him front and center of that historical stage. He's not. He's going through this incredibly turbulent time as a young man trying to find his way in his own career, trying to navigate all kinds of issues, not knowing where things are going, not knowing where they're going to lead. And it's one of the factors that I think makes him so moving and gives him this special radar for understanding what it means to live in a larger historical moment. His friend Paul Lehman, who studied with him at Union Seminary and of course later becomes a professor of theology at Princeton, once said that Bonhoeffer had this extraordinary gift for discerning the signs of the times. That is, he has an antenna that kind of, he's able to recognize what is happening and interpret it. And Lehman's comment was that this was one of the things he thought that made his theology so extraordinary. And I think it's a factor in why his writings seem so timeless. I've been giving Bonhoeffer talks for about 25 years now. And I think almost every time I have spoken somewhere, somebody stands up in the Q&A and says, "Are we having a Bonhoeffer moment?" And over the course of 25 years, that means lots of different things. And I think that signals to us that he does manage to speak in a way that puts its finger on the challenges of that connection between what it means to be living in a particular historical moment and what it calls us to do as people of faith.
Well, let's get down to that then. You titled that book, I think I held up, your recent book on Bonhoeffer's essay that he wrote after 10 years. But the subtitle of that book was Dietrich Bonhoeffer for Our Times. So in what sense is Bonhoeffer a theologian for our times, that Bonhoeffer moment? How would you speak to that?
Yeah, so I'll get to after 10 years in a minute. Let me first say a couple of preliminary things to get some insight into where he's coming from. The first thing I would say that has struck me about him as I studied him is that he does have this remarkable sense of clarity about what's going on around him. It's very striking in 1933. As soon as Hitler comes to power, he writes a couple of essays on, why younger Germans are so drawn to the National Socialist movement, why they see Hitler as a new messiah, what issues his church is going to be facing. And with each of these essays, he's spot on. It's like he can cut through all the propaganda and all the panic and the turmoil and say, so look, this is the main question here that we need to address. It's especially striking. There's a letter that actually not many people know about from 1934. So he's writing this letter from London. He has left Nazi Germany in September of 1933 to go to serve several churches in London and stays there until 1935, but he's keeping abreast of developments back in Germany. And in 1934, you still have leaders of the German churches, including leaders who are in the confessing church, who think that if they could just sit down for a long meeting with Adolf Hitler, they could set him straight on some things. And Bonhoeffer writes this letter to his friend Erwin Sutz in Switzerland, in which he says there is no point in doing that. And his words are, Hitler has shown himself quite plainly for what he is, and the church ought to know with whom it has to reckon. We are the ones to be converted, not Hitler. And the first time I read that, I thought, what does he mean by that last sentence? We're the ones who need to be converted. On the one hand, he's saying, look, let's not try to sway this guy. We know who he is. But what is he saying in terms of their own moment? And I think what he means is he's looking ahead at the path for his church, not knowing where this is going to lead, but recognizing that a large part of the German Protestant church has aligned itself with National Socialism and is very sympathetic to what is going on. A small minority are deeply troubled by this, but they don't know which way to take. And when he returns to Germany in 1935, he returns to direct one of the confessing church seminaries, a seminary called Finkenwalde, which is way out in the middle of nowhere, and to train young men for the ministry. And let me just make one comment before I get to the Finkenwalde experience. One of the things that has struck me as I've studied Bonhoeffer is his personality, as far as one can discern that. And I just translated this book on Karl Barth, and Barth is such a contrast in terms of personality because Barth really likes to fight. Barth, knows how to fight. He's, when somebody pushes him, he pushes right back. The first chapter in the biography, they go into his school records, and Barth is constantly in the principal's office. He's in detention all the time. He even writes in his diary, "Today I beat some people up, and I got beaten back up. It was a great day." I mean, this is Karl Barth. And Niemöller was like that as well. I mentioned that I was able to interview Niemöller for my first book. And it was fascinating to experience him in person. So I interviewed him in 1981. He was just about to turn 90, but still, sharp as a tack. And after the interview, I remember asking him something about a politician, and it was as if I had flipped a switch. He straightened up. He let me know in no uncertain terms what he thought of that politician. He was really angry, and you're ready to take him out and beat him up. And that's how Niemöller moves through this period as well. You have these people in the church who are willing to really push at what the Nazis are doing. And Bonhoeffer is really a contrast to that, because you get the sense that he struggles with this. He agonizes over it. It's one reason he goes to London in 1933 at the height of the church struggle. He leaves. And I think it's partly because he has so much trouble handling the tension of that moment. So when he comes back to Germany and oversees this seminary in Finkenwalde, you see, and you literally see this in the documentation when you're reading through the Bonhoeffer works. You see it's as though he breathes and he thinks, I'm finally in the right place. And the right place for him is converting his church, beginning with the clergy, the seminarians he's teaching. What he does in Finkenwalde is train them to be pastors in a church that exists in a totalitarian state. And for all he knows, this is going to be a totalitarian state for the rest of their lives, the rest of their ministries. So he's giving them the tools with how they need to stay on course, how they need to practice their ministry, how they need to look for moral support. And that Finkenwalde experience in which he has them meditate, he has them confess to each other, he does all these, what we would today call team building exercises. He's trying to create a core of people who know absolutely that they can depend on each other because they're going to need it. And so those Finkenwalde years, I think, are really revealing in terms of his focus. And during this period, this is from 1935 to 39, a lot going on in Nazi Germany. The German Protestant church by this time has largely caved to National Socialism. The confessing church is wrenched by divisions. Nobody knows what course to take. And there are other people on the landscape, this is what I learned from doing my first book, who are more activist, if you will, who are actually more politically engaged. Bonhoeffer looks as though he's not doing that, but I'll tell you, when I worked on the volume of the Bonhoeffer works for Finkenwalde, I went back and reread Discipleship, and I completely understood it differently. Because Discipleship for him is the book that if they want to follow the path of discipleship through this turbulent time, this is what they need to know. And it's grounded in his early insight, which is there from the beginning of his theological work, that if you're going to follow Christ, you have to respect and minister to Christ in your neighbor. That the place where we encounter Christ today is in the neighbor. And of course, his book on discipleship is built around the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, that's the spirit that he's trying to infuse into the confessing church at that point. So then, Finkenwalde is closed down in 1937. It goes underground for 2 years. He's in and out of Germany. He's already learning about, various plans for resistance activity from members of his family. He comes to New York in 1939 briefly. He goes back. And the period after that, we sort of think of as Bonhoeffer's period in the resistance. Again, I would argue when you look at it up close, it takes a while for him to move into that space. I would argue that when he returns to Germany from 1939, he's going back for his family and his students. He has no idea of where this is going to take him. He doesn't want to serve in the German military. He applies to be a conscientious objector. He applies to be a chaplain. There's sort of an 18-month period there after the war begins when he's looking for different ways to get out of the military. And finally, one of his brothers-in-law, Hans von Donati, who has a high-ranking job in the Justice Ministry, gets him a deferment, and gets him the deferment by giving him an office in the German counterintelligence, and it's the office in which you have people who are talking about overthrowing the regime. So that's how he ends up there. I will add, this is something that often gets lost. Bonhoeffer is one of 8 confessing church pastors that gets deferments by being assigned to the Abwehr. So he's not the only one. He's not the only one who gets assigned to the office in Munich. There's another pastor who is working with the Kreisau Resistance Circle who's also there. So, he's not the only game in town, and there's a lot of background maneuvering and contention there. So let me just, I can go into more detail about the resistance in response to questions. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but let me make an observation and then we'll get to after 10 years. Bonhoeffer comes from an academic family, a family, I would say, of post-Enlightenment ethos. Most of them are not really in the church. They're, Christmas and Easter Christians. They're still members. But he's the one who is pulled toward the deeper theology. And they are all high-ranking, well-known, well-educated German elites. And those are the people who kept the Nazi regime. They made it possible. They kept it propped up. Not Bonhoeffer's family necessarily, but that sector of German society. And the Bonhoeffer family lives in Grunewald, which is a part of Berlin that is well-to-do. So you have a lot of people in Grunewald who are Prussian military officers, members of the various ministries. They make their careers in the Nazi regime until they decide they can't do that anymore. And that moment of truth comes at different points for different people. For some of them, and I would say this applies to several people in the July 20th conspiracy, it comes pretty late. It doesn't come until after Stalingrad, until it looks like Germany's going to lose the war. And at that point, they feel that something has to be done about Adolf Hitler. So the resistance circle that Bonhoeffer finds himself in is perhaps the most morally compromised, morally complex group of people in the whole landscape of resistance figures in Nazi Germany. And this is where Bonhoeffer ends up. So reading his writings during that period, this is the period during which he writes Ethics. It's the period during which he reflects on church-state relations and what might be the future of Germany after National Socialism. And it's the moment in which he writes this remarkable essay, After 10 Years, which Donald mentioned before I begin to speak. So After 10 Years is a letter he writes to several people who were especially close to him in late 1943. As the title might suggest, what it refers to is after 10 years of National Socialism. So this is his analysis of what has happened in Germany between 1933 and 1943. If you have heard a Bonhoeffer quote, it's probably from this essay. This is the essay where he writes about stupidity and civil disobedience and civil courage, and also has some of the most moving, vulnerable statements about where they find themselves that exist in his opus. Primarily, I would note, and I'll read these aloud because these are famous quotes, but this is to signal where I think he has ended up at that particular moment. The famous, "We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have become cunning and learned the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Experience has rendered us suspicious of human beings, and often we have failed to speak to them a true and open word. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down or even made us cynical. Are we still of any use?" Followed by his section on the view from below. "It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of suffering." I would argue that that is a late recognition for Bonhoeffer. It's not where he is in 1933, as long as although he is very clear about the evils of National Socialism, but the gradual experience of moving with his church and his nation on the road that leads from 1933 to 1943, by which time, by the way, over half of the European Jews have already been murdered. It's at the point where suddenly he realizes what it really does mean to be oppressed, to be on the outskirts of your society, to be vulnerable to persecution or imprisonment or execution. And I think one of the fascinating things for him is, as I mentioned earlier, his antenna for navigating these issues during his year of study in New York in 1930 to 31, a student at Union Theological Seminary. He becomes friends with an African-American student and often attends church in Harlem at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And I think instinctively, he recognizes that what he hears preached in Abyssinian, the voice of the Black church, is the message, is at the heart of the gospel. It's at the heart of what Jesus is talking about when he commands his followers to follow him. It's the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. I think it informs his book on discipleship. And being open to that, being open to thinking about that, he follows that path until he reaches the point where he looks around and says, so here we are. We are standing with the victims of history, and this is what that really means. And that's why I think After 10 Years is such an extraordinary document. It's sometimes read as sort of the Bonhoeffer, the resistor. And I sometimes feel in American culture, especially in American Protestant culture, that there's sort of this John Wayne-like vision of Bonhoeffer leading the charge against Hitler. And I would argue that it's the opposite, that we're looking at this progression that I've just described. And that's one of the things that has made him increasingly moving to me personally. And that I just found fascinating as I was, working through his writings. And I think it makes him a good companion for us in this moment. So I'll just wind up there.
Well, if people have questions, put them in the question and answer, hit that question and answer thing and type in questions for Vicki. So one thing that occurs to me, Vicki, is you did mention Bonhoeffer's clarity, and very shortly after that, you were talking about propaganda. And it seems to me that that's one of the features of his time and our time that really do run parallel. We live in a time of propaganda, which I don't think we've seen in this country for a very long time. Is there anything more to say about Bonhoeffer's ability to cut through that or see through that or put it into perspective in a way that could be helpful to us who are being bombarded by forms of communication that he could never have imagined?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I think so, especially in 1933, 34, 35, as the church struggle is unfolding and you have the founding of this confessing church movement, which arises to counter the pro-Nazi faction within German Protestantism called the Deutsche Christen, the German Christians. The German Christians are anti-Semitism, propaganda, Nazism all the time. I mean, they kind of emerge in what we would today call Christian nationalism. So they combine the imagery of National Socialism with Christian imagery. And so they're really pushing this version, if you will, of Christianity. And initially, I would say Bonhoeffer's perspective and that of the people who found the confessing church is that the antidote to that is to call this out for the heresy it is, and to tell people to really return to their Bibles and take a good look at their Bibles and kind of use Christian teaching as a critique of the propaganda. The interesting thing is that doesn't really work. And it's worth, really, it was one of the things I wrestled with in my first book, or I asked people about in that first book. So if these people are, distorting Christian teachings and turning them into a very different ideological thing, why doesn't it work to go back and read things? And the reason, of course, is the interpretation that you need a broader political lens to really kind of say, so this is not just a misuse of Christianity, but a misuse for what end? I mean, what are people doing politically here? And so Bonhoeffer is throughout the 1930s is very cautious about that. More cautious, I would say, than some other people in the confessing church. But I think it's one of the things that leads him to conclude that the protest from within the church has run into a wall. It has its limits, and he is more open than I would say to the conversations about the conspiracy and the need for political resistance. I will add, this might be a good point to mention this, although I see there are more questions coming in. That one of the questions I often get is, how did Bonhoeffer justify his role in the resistance or his presence there with Christian teaching, since this was a resistance that was going to overthrow the regime and murder the top echelon of leaders? And the answer is that he didn't. I asked Eberhard Bethge this question back in the 1980s, and he said Bonhoeffer deliberately refused to portray this or to claim the sanction of the Christian church for what he was doing because he understood the dangers of that, particularly given the ideological versions of Christianity you had in Nazi Germany. So what Bonhoeffer did, and this is what his book on ethics is all about, is argue that we have free will and we make choices based on the circumstances as we see them, and we have to answer for that. And he was willing to answer for it, but he wasn't going to pretend that this was justified theologically. And I think it's an interesting insight into the way his mind works, but it's also important for understanding where he begins to come from.
Well, we have a lot of really good questions, and I'm just going to take them in the order in which they came in, and I hope we're able to get to them all. So Peter asks the following question, and let me just say this. One of the things that seems to differentiate our time from Bonhoeffer's time is by the time 1933 and certainly 1936, 1937 roll around, it's not polarized anymore. It's at least not openly. But Peter asks this question: what does Bonhoeffer offer to the church today divided by politics on the right and the center and the left?
Yeah. So he was very clear in accepting the polarization. The church actually was polarized. And in Bonhoeffer, and there were a number of people who wanted to keep the German Protestant church together. They didn't want it to split into a German Christian church and a confessing church, and then you had all these people kind of in the middle. And Bonhoeffer was one of the few people arguing for a split. He said, we can't be in the same church with these people. So
That's interesting.
he would be on the side of polarization. It was something he was very clear cut about under those circumstances. Now, that's not, the complete equivalent of what we see today, but it is this voice for clarity. You can't bring people back together without people being clear about where they're coming from. And if you want consensus, you have to find your way to that. And I think this was, Bonhoeffer was, I mentioned he wasn't a good fighter, but he was clear. He was clear. He knew what was what.
Thank you. That's a great question, Peter. Thank you. Dana asks the following question. Arguably, the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus was comparable in evil to Nazi Germany, yet the New Testament urges submission to civil authorities. How did Bonhoeffer deal with that in ultimately supporting an attempt to kill civil leadership in wartime?
Yeah. This is the Romans chapter, to be obedient to your rulers. And Bonhoeffer again tackles that in 1933, because this is the text that lots of German pastors and bishops are using. We have a new government, we have to be loyal to it. We can, we have our little sphere of the church. That's where we exercise our authority, but we have to be loyal to worldly authority. And what Bonhoeffer does already in 1933, this is the fascinating core of his essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, is he makes the case that, yes, this is what Lutherans especially, this is a core part of Lutheran teaching, is obedience to state authority. But he then says, but what happens when your state authority is not legitimate? And how do you tell that it's not legitimate? And in that essay, he argues that the Nazi regime is not legitimate because it's persecuting a minority. And he says, so if you're the church and you're under state authority that is not legitimate, what do? And this is the famous sequence where he says, first you speak out for the victims, whether they're Christian or not. Then you, assert yourself as the church and try to help the victims. And ultimately, you may have to put the spoke in the wheel. You may need to stop the church, the state from exercising its. And so it's based on the illegitimacy of the Nazi state. And I would say that's the same argument he makes in the Resistance. That now as I said, he doesn't make the claim that it's consistent with Christian teachings to assassinate a bunch of political leaders, because he doesn't want to go there. But he does say that it's his personal political judgment that there is no other way around this, and that the conspirators will have to answer for it. But every person who knew him, who later was able to talk about where he stood on this issue, says that number one, he supported the aims of the Resistance, and secondly, that he didn't pretend that this was consistent with Christian teaching.
So Mike wants to push you and says, so would you say that we are in a Bonhoeffer moment in the US right now? And if not, when have been other Bonhoeffer moments in the 20th or early 21st century?
Yeah. And I'm not saying this to be snarky or facetious, I stay away from Bonhoeffer moments because, as I said, they tend to try to frame him as in a certain role, as an activist, as a John Wayne-like figure, or however you want to put it. Whereas when you look at him between the period of 1933 to 1945, There are actually a fair number of moments when he makes compromises that are actually kind of shocking. I didn't go into that in my remarks, but there are times when he tells people to keep quiet, to hedge their bets. There are times when he himself doesn't speak out. I think that's part of the acknowledgement he makes in After 10 Years, where he says, we have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. So, you know, I don't think Bonhoeffer moments are useful in terms of, so folks, what do we do now? You know, storm the barricades? You know, I think Bonhoeffer is actually more useful in thinking about, you know, here we are in the long term. We can see what has led us here. And in our case, I would say, you know, let's go all the way back to the beginning of United States history. Let's look at the, you know, genocide of the Native Americans, at the phenomenon of slavery, at the, you know, different points in our history in which these issues have broken back open. Let's look at the many different factors that are coming together today to create what we're seeing. And, you know, look at where we personally have come and what our options are now within our own sphere. And that means every individual looking, you know, in their church, in their profession, in their circle of friends, in whatever capacity, to explore how we can behave responsibly in a way that we can answer for at this particular moment. I heard a wonderful sermon a couple of years ago about this, and the message, it was a wonderful sermon because I remember how many sermons do you remember? But the minister sort of ended up by saying, so this is what it all boils down to. You've got to be who you are in your own context. You've got to use what you've got, whatever tools are at your command, and you've got to do what you can. So being passive isn't an option. So we need to find ways in our own sphere to be active, but we also need to, you know, understand as we move along to recognize what's changing and to watch for the signs of the times. And I think that's where Bonhoeffer is so good.
These are great questions, and we could talk about each one of them at great length, but I am going to press on because there are other good questions coming along. And Crystal says, as a Black woman navigating the times and having navigated seminary and evangelical setting, the impact of Bonhoeffer's experiences at Abyssinia is a huge thing that gets overlooked or under-acknowledged. Do you have additional thoughts to share about that particular part of Bonhoeffer's life?
Yeah, you know, this is something I think a great deal about. And, you know, two works that I would recommend to people. One, of course, is Reggie Williams's wonderful Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which gives sort of a, again, both the larger context of the Harlem Renaissance and, you know, this young German moving into that context. And the earlier book by Josiah Young called No Difference in the Fair, which is a wonderful exploration of this issue. So I think that Bonhoeffer was drawn to these issues because he grew up in a family that taught its children to be interested in social issues. I mean, this is something you see throughout the 1920s, that they get engaged in different things, that they all have some level of social awareness of social justice issues. So, you know, this drives Bonhoeffer to Abyssinia, and at the same time, while he's at Union, he begins to read, you know, all these Black American writers, read poetry. You know, he not only goes to church, but he begins to read African American writers and thinkers. Then he goes back to Germany. He actually notably takes a recording of spirituals and plays them for his seminarians at Finkenwalde who have no context or any idea about how to process this. And it kind of, on the surface at least, drops off his radar. One of the things that is really striking to me when he goes back to New York in 1939 in the summer, he's there for 5 weeks. And it's very clear from his diary of that period that he is really wrestling with things. But he doesn't seem to have gone back to Abyssinia, and I've always wondered about that. So I feel that there are questions there. I agree that the fact that this was on his radar, that he, understood. He himself compared some of the things he saw in Nazi Germany with the Jim Crow laws that he saw in this country. He wrote about lynchings. He actually, when he was at Union, wrote back to his supervisor in the German church and said, the German church needs to speak out about lynchings. So he, this was something that moved him and that worked within him. There's not enough in his writings where we see, you can kind of read between the lines, but this is one of my big questions. And this, somebody working on a dissertation, somebody listening to this, these are avenues that I think one could continue to explore.
Great. And we'll get the citations to those books up on our website so people can look, just in case you missed them. Laura thanks you for your insights and is interested to hear some of your thoughts about the influence and role of women in the confessing church. Gertrude Steven and many others who are unnamed. And in the post-war Reconstruction area, especially if you have any insights from your interviews in Germany.
Yeah, this is such a great question, and thank you for asking it. So in my book, For the Soul of the People, this was where I first stumbled on this. The first generation of German women who could study theology and get theological degrees graduated in 1927. So they were starting their careers right as the church struggle was beginning, and many of them end up in the confessing church. And I was able to interview about 25 of these women, I think. So I've got a chapter in my book on the women in the confessing church who were struggling for recognition, ordination, for their own role in the church while the church struggle is going on. There are a few men in the confessing church who stand with them and support them, notably Helmut Gollwitzer. Bonhoeffer is not one of them, which is kind of interesting because he knew some of them and in fact had a very close relationship of some kind with Elizabeth Sinn, who was one of these women. He doesn't say anything about the fight for ordination. He doesn't include women in Finkenwalde. There is a confessing church seminary, the one in Berlin, where most of these women end up. And I would say actually that's of the confessing church seminaries that's most out there in terms of their politics. It's the one in Berlin. It's not Finkenwalde. After 1945, so short answer, during the war, all the men in the confessing church get drafted if they're able to serve in the army. And so the confessing church, to the extent that it keeps going in the war years, keeps going because it is ministered to by these women. They take over the churches, they take over pastorates. Some of them are ordained on an emergency basis. And after 1945, the church actually tries to rescind those ordinations. So they have to continue to fight these battles after 1945. So I don't see Bonhoeffer as a feminist. I'll give a short anecdote. One of the women I interviewed, Helga Zimmermann, I asked her the usual question. I said, didn't you study with Bonhoeffer? Her husband had been in Finkenwalde. And I said, so how did Bonhoeffer view this? And she just kind of looked at me and she said, he was a misogynist. So, I wouldn't, I don't see any promise for Bonhoeffer in terms of feminist thought. But it's a great question because these women and their theological work are certainly deserving of being on the radar when we look at that big picture of the confessing church.
Interesting. So Joanna asks, what similarities do you see between the rise of nationalism in Germany and the current distortions of Christianity and nationalism in the United States now?
Yeah. So there are certain characteristics to nationalism, and I would specify especially Christian nationalism, that look pretty much the same. I mean, the way in which a certain ideological agenda is embraced and sanctified by church leaders and factions of the church. And so that, the dynamics of that in the 1930s, are very similar in many respects to the dynamics we see today. I would also add that there are, we need to look not just to Nazi Germany, but we can look at American history. You have developments during the 1920s and 30s in this country in which you have a rise of sort of nationalist versions of Christianity that begin to fight culture war issues, the fundamentalism wars of the 1920s, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of Father Coughlin and his Christian Front in the 1930s. These are all American phenomena that show that this can happen anywhere. When I was working at the Holocaust Museum, we had a couple of conferences that looked at the rise of what we called ethno-nationalist religion, because there's always this ethnicized aspect that is part of this. We looked at these groups across the Western world during the 20s and 30s. They're not just in Germany, they are in Italy, France, Norway, Eastern Europe, and they're in the United States. So, you see things, we see Nazi Germany as one separate sector of this, but it's a much broader set of issues, and I would argue today as well.
I'm just going to, I think we have time to cover these other questions, but when you talked about this a little bit earlier in your discussion, you said that Bonhoeffer did not shrink away from calling something a heresy.
Right.
And there are, political Christian nationalism positions out there today, dominionism, let's just say, as one of them. But we're not having that conversation.
Yeah.
We're not having that theological conversation.
Yeah. It's a great observation. One of my favorite essays in the Bonhoeffer works is his 1939 essay, which he writes in New York, called Protestantism Without Reformation, which he compares the American church scene with the German church scene. And it's really interesting because this is after 6 years of watching his church cave to National Socialism. But one of his points about the American church is you've got all these different denominations, and to have one singular coherent conversation about what constitutes heresy, about ejecting somebody from the ministry, about denying them communion. We don't have that here because you've got all these different churches and you don't have a unified context, even a unified theological context, because you have all these not just denominational differences, but there are theological reasons for those denominational differences. You don't have that kind of conversation today. Now, to some extent you did during the 30s. American Protestantism, mainline Protestantism was a little bit more unified during the 1930s, and you had significant theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr who were very outspoken. But that's no longer the case with our landscape.
Yeah, interesting. So John asks, are there ways that you see Bonhoeffer being misused today? It seems that there have been movement by those who are not on the underside of history, but the opposite,
Right.
who have appealed to Bonhoeffer as a champion for their cause.
Yes, this is a big problem in American Protestantism. If you Google my name and that of Eric Metaxas, you will come across my review of Mr. Metaxas's biography, which I felt was ideologically driven. And I think that, I am still justified in my judgment of that. So yes, Bonhoeffer does get misused. And it's another reason to try to get at these conversations at a deeper level than just the Bonhoeffer moment, because people from all points in the spectrum claim Bonhoeffer. One of my favorite stories, the historian Robert Erickson is a good friend of mine, and he wrote a book about the German Christian bishops or theologians, of course, who supported National Socialism, and was at a gathering some years ago of leading figures from all points of the Protestant spectrum. So leading evangelicals, leading liberal theologians, all in the same room discussing his book. And I said, so what was that like? And he looked at me, he said, every man in that room thought he was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And that's why I think Bonhoeffer might be more useful as a critical conversation partner for us today if we don't if we take him off that pedestal and really look at his work and think of him as somebody moving through a complicated time the way we are moving through a complicated time.
So I'm sorry if I mispronounced this name, Kittam. Thinking about your reference to who needs to be converted, and after 10 years, mention of not being able to talk to the other side. I wonder how that relates to us today at a time when ability to communicate across differences often seems impossible.
You know, what I wonder this week, where we are all, most of us are very shaken and alarmed and distraught at the state of our republic, not knowing where things are going and seeing the violence. That is a moment that is a potential opening point for deep grief and repentance and vulnerability. That is actually, or that was the starting point for some of the post-Holocaust conversations after 1945, where people came to the conversation not trying to justify their point of view, but just saying, wow, whatever my part was in what just happened, we have to do something different. And so there are different ways at broaching that conversation. I don't think it's useful to debate, you know, what I believe and what you believe, but to say, so what could we do right now to repair what is broken and to help those who have been hurt, and to act in a form of meaningful solidarity with those who really need our help. Because that, if we're going to rebuild this country and repair some of the damage, that's where we have to start. And an important part of that, and I think Bonhoeffer gets at this, is listening to the voices of those who have historically been disenfranchised, persecuted, vulnerable, listening to the voices of the Black church. I told somebody yesterday who asked about whether we're having a Bonhoeffer moment, I said, you know, why don't we have a James Baldwin moment? Why don't we have a Martin Luther King Jr. letter from a Birmingham jail moment? You know, if we're going to open up a new conversation, maybe we should be starting there, not necessarily with Bonhoeffer.
So Jane asks, in light of religionless Christianity, which comes up in letters and papers from prison, what is the connection between Bonhoeffer and contemporary secular theology, or contemporary theology that leans in the direction of atheism?
Nothing. So here's my quick and dirty take on religionless Christianity. And again, this is something where I've really changed my mind over the years and really been thinking about that a lot recently. Bonhoeffer makes a distinction from the very beginning of his theological work between religion and faith. Religion is a human construct. It's our language, our attempt to put God and our faith into a coherent narrative, and as such, it is a human construct and inherently flawed. What Bonhoeffer says is that God reaches to us through the figure of Jesus Christ coming into the world in history. And if you want to be a faithful Christian, you just have to follow that Christ. That's what he writes about in Discipleship. I think that his writings in prison about religion as Christianity take that farther, where he says, so we need to dismiss all of our ideologically shaped understandings of religion and simply follow our Lord. And I think that's where he ended up. So religionless Christianity, I would say, is a return to the essential faith of discipleship. And I'm happy to talk longer about that, but we don't have time.
And I'd love to hear you speak about that, Vicki, but we are out of time. So thank you very much, Vicki, for sharing your deep knowledge and insight with us. Thank you all of you who are online for joining us today. And thank you for the fantastic questions, really sharp and insightful themselves. And we invite all of you to join us for future events here at Collegeville Connections. Please watch for event information and registration details for upcoming Collegeville Connection events. On January 27th, so 2 weeks from today, same time, noon to 1 o'clock Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Pastor Rachel Twigg Boyce, vicar at St. Benedict's Table in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who will be speaking about the creative ways in which her congregation has come to awareness about the importance of vocation for both individuals and the community there at St. Benedict's Table. So thank you all again for joining us, and please join us again. Stay safe, be well, peace.